Hi, welcome to the Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Thanks for joining the conversation. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Helen Hsu and Dr. Catherine Teotico about AAPI Heritage Month and Mental Health Awareness Month. We address the high rate of suicide amongst AAPI college students and ways to raise awareness for mental health. I really enjoyed my conversation with these two phenomenal women, and I'm grateful to learn more about their immigrant stories and their journeys in becoming passionate psychologists. Dr. Hsu is a renowned public speaker, educator, and clinician who draws from her own lived experience as a bicultural, bilingual immigrant. She's the founder of Helen Mental Health and serves in leadership positions for several psychological associations. Dr. Catherine Teotico is currently a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA Counseling and Psychological Services, who specializes in working with Asian Americans, immigrants, first-generation college students, international students, and students of color. As always, please rate my podcast on your platform of choice and share it with others. If you would like to support this podcast and the work I do with a donation, you can become a patron of the show by visiting my website or patreon.com/SifuMimiChan. For comments or suggestions, reach out on social media at SifuMimiChan. Now, on with the show. Hello, ladies. Thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I am privileged to not just have one, but two amazing doctors here to talk about mental health and AAPI Heritage Month. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about both of you. If you could just introduce yourself, tell me a little about your background and what drew you to mental health and psychology in general. So Helen, we could start with you, Dr. Hsu.
Mm-hmm. Hi, I'm Helen, and I am currently a clinical psychologist, and I'm at Stanford University. And also I have my own business, Helen Mental Health, yay NorCal. But I am an immigrant from Taiwan, and I think really what got me into mental health was at UCLA. Asian American Studies and psychology were the only classes that really, I never got tired of learning. And what keeps me really engaged is just there's so much need in this world, and there's so much prevention we can do to spare people suffering or help people heal. And so that's like constantly interesting and rewarding.
Thank you. And Catherine, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Catherine Teotico. I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at UCLA CAPS. So calling back to Dr. Hsu's alma mater and mine as well. But I think what got me really interested, I am too an immigrant from the Philippines, moved here to America when I was about 13, and just kind of seeing the impact of immigration. I also have a number of family members who have autism spectrum disorder. And so that kind of just really got me interested in mental health and how that's talked about in Asian American communities, even when the need is so high. And so I'm just really passionate about this work. And I've actually gone back to UCLA and just kind of seen the growth of Asian American psychology and mental health. And it just kind of reinvigorates my spirit to keep going on this journey.
Fantastic. I am very inspired by both of you right now. I have my own kind of personal journey with mental health and finding therapy and learning that it's important to share that, right? Especially, in my position, I'm a Kung Fu teacher and a leader and a mentor to so many people. I thought that, it was something that was very important for me to be able to utilize my position to encourage others that you don't have to be, suffering from something greatly. You shouldn't stigmatize it, and that it's something to be proud of, not something to be embarrassed of. And it was not an easy thing. I didn't really share a lot about that until I was much older. And so I see that age range changing for this next generation, which is really fantastic. And full disclosure, I'm also at the same time with coming out with my story about mental health, I also shared my experience as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And so all of these things kind of come together into something that's very personal to me. And so the fact that you both are doing so much work in the field, I just want to thank you, first of all. And, and I'm really excited to kind of hear more about that. Now, having said all of that, my parents were part of the reason I was kind of scared to share. So I was curious, for you as, being Asian American now and living here and having Asian families, how was that news for them that you were going to study this and make this part of your career? So we can start with Helen.
Mm-hmm. Maybe one thing about my family is that I have an older brother. He's the oldest son of the oldest son. And I think so much attention was focused on him that it was like, and he chose a non-traditional path. He joined the United States Marine Corps. Okay. So by the time I was going to college, they're like, oh my God, just go. Like, if you pick anything, just like, it's, better than doing the military. And definitely my parents were like, psychology, like, what does anybody do with that? But generally my parents are just supportive. And they could see that I was a non-traditional student. I actually hated high school, even though I went to a very acclaimed school that all the Asian families in this community try to go to. So I actually had left high school at 16. And so my parents could see that psychology was something that actually engaged me in a way that was different. And and I also wanted to say, like, thank you for like sharing and being a leader about like also like what it means to take care of your mental and physical health as a holistic being, right? As an educator now that I'm like mid-career, late career, like I often will talk when I give workshops and I'll say like, who is like, a provider, an educator, a family member, loved one, caregiver, friend, and who's been a patient. And it's like, I'm all of these things. I've been all these things. And most of us at some point in our lives may be in any of these roles. Mm-hmm. And that has definitely grown over the years. So yeah, so for my family, it was like, we don't really know what this is, but I guess, And I will say, when I worked at my first postdoc job was Asian Community Mental Health Services in Oakland, Chinatown. It's now part of Asian Health Services. Like, people would ask things like, oh, Asian mental health. Do you have any clients? Because Asians don't go to therapy, right? And it's like, we have a waiting list. You never hear about it, but we have a waiting list. We have just as much need, if not more, than any other community.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. And Catherine, what about you?
Yeah, so it's very interesting because actually my mother had a PhD in psychology, but she got that after becoming a medical doctor. And when we all immigrated here, I think it's a typical immigrant story, which is you go for the safer career. You go for the career that has, like a stable job, longevity. And so my parents pushed me more into kind of like being a medical doctor or being a nurse. And so it took a little bit of time to get into psychology. There's also kind of within my own family, this idea of like depression doesn't really exist. You kind of just like pull yourselves up by the bootstraps. And so it took a little bit of convincing to kind of get them into like, this is the career I want. I'm not going to go to medical school first and then get it. Like, this is the thing that I'm really, really passionate about. And I think there was hesitance about that, just with every kind of immigrant parent who doesn't know a career, especially in a foreign country. But I think what really solidified it for both of my parents was the COVID-19 pandemic. And in a lot of ways, seeing how traumatized our entire community, especially the healthcare community, was, kind of solidified for them. There is such a big need for this. And we all need healing, and that takes in many different forms. For some people, that's still prayer. I grew up in a Catholic community. For some people, that's mental health. And so there's still, of course, like hesitancy. The rest of my brothers are medical doctors, so there's this foreignness to what is psychology, but I think they've come around to it. And I think just as Helen was saying as well, there is such a big need about mental health, especially in the Filipino community. I am often sitting with a lot of my extended family now who've come around and said, who else are Filipino psychologists who we can go to, because you're the only one. And the conference I actually just left is the DOFA conference, which is the Division of Filipino Americans. But even in there's like 24 people that are there, and they're spread all across the nation. So there's still kind of this huge gap of people in the Asian American community who want it and need it and feel the need to be understood. Because just because there is Asian American psychologists doesn't mean that they match culturally, because we're coming from 47 different countries and communities and cultures, and it's not always going to be a match. And so I think my parents have thankfully like come around to the importance of this work, but it took a little bit of convincing.
Yeah, and actually, thank you for bringing that up, because I know, Dr. Hsu, on your website, you said, like, I think it was 6% of mental health professionals in the US are Asian American heritage, and that was really surprising to me to see that number one be so low. And then maybe you could speak to, which was the next part of it, about the fact that you don't necessarily, like, I don't have to see an Asian American therapist because it's for me personally, but there was something very specific you mentioned about the type of training and why it is important to have a little bit of extra knowledge of, especially for immigrant experience and especially for BIPOC community.
Yeah. It is true that many people are looking for a similar culture therapist just because it is so much easier if you don't have to explain everything, right? Especially a lot of us have different immigrant stories, or even more traumatic refugee stories, intergenerational trauma. It's a lot to have to spend your precious therapy time if you're like, okay, so this is the thing that happened 2 generations ago in the Philippines or in Cambodia, and someone has no idea. So there's this shortcut that most of us are trying to look for, maybe a similar background, or at least maybe a person of color who could relate to some of the experiences. The latest Center for Disease Control survey on youth said something like more than a quarter of young people said they were experienced racism actively in recent years, right? And so that's a really important life experience. If someone has no idea, that's really hard. But we are only about 6% of psychologists. I think last time I checked, maybe 7% of master's level therapists, 17% of psychiatrists, but still, right? Really not enough. And so if you can't find someone with a cultural match, then at least there's some questions you can ask when you're meeting a therapist to be like, do you have training? Do you get it? Because the worst thing that could happen is that I actually make this effort to seek treatment, and this person either wastes my time or sometimes actually says something harmful. I've had students who've seen a therapist who really made them feel bad and kind of looked down or didn't understand their family obligations or some of their values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I can see how that can be frustrating. And, I did just have Dr. Jeannie on the show, who we talked about that a bit as well, because she actually shared one of her experiences that I was so shocked about, because I think I got really lucky and I matched with the first person I spoke to. And one of the things that we talked about was it's this misconception that you just call a first person up and then that's it. That's your match. That's your person. So Catherine, maybe you can share a little bit about that process and making it feel normal for people to realize you have to kind of interview, and also it's a relationship, right? You have to feel comfortable. Maybe you could talk about what that experience has been like, and how people can kind of find their match.
For sure. Yeah. And I'll share my own personal experience. It took me about 5 different therapists until I found the person that I was like, this is my person. They get me. And they actually aren't they're not of Filipino heritage. Yeah. It took a while because, as you all are kind of alluding to, I still vividly remember I was speaking about, family dynamics, and my white therapist paused and stopped me and said, you just sound like all my Chinese clients. And I was just so baffled and stopped and couldn't even process I'm over here trying to process the experience of my family and the uniqueness of the Filipino culture. And then you kind of just minimize that into an entire group of people that I don't even identify with. And so it took a lot of that process. And I think one of the things I tell my students, I work a lot with students who I have to unfortunately refer out because of limitations within our system, is it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of like speed dating in a way. There's this moment where you have to a little bit trust your gut of, I'm on the same level of this person. We have the same energy. And they're understanding some of the moments that I'm experiencing. Right. And for me, that takes I personally use humor through that. So I'll kind of make a self-deprecating joke about culture or something. And if they're responding to me in the same level with that same kind of cultural humility that I'm able to bring into the room, then I'm like, okay, we might not be exactly a match here, but we're able to kind of speak to the same level of consciousness in it. And it's okay. And I tell my clients this, it's okay if 4 or 5 sessions in, you're like, actually, you're not the person for me. Like, I think you got me on this level, but I don't think you have me on this level. And I actually did see a therapist for about 8 sessions, and we did amazing work on other things. Mm-hmm. And then when I got to the cultural aspects and started talking very specifically about my culture, they were really just not on the same level. And I kind of had to take my own space and assert, this isn't the space for me to talk about this. And to Helen's point, I'm paying a copay, right? Like, I'm wasting time explaining to you the very importance of my Filipino culture, and it's okay for me to walk away. So I kind of tell people there is a vibe piece that you have to trust, ask certain questions about cultural pieces, bring yourself into it. I think sometimes with my Asian American clients that I work with, they want to be like the perfect, the good, like, client. And I'm like, no, just, this is your space, own it, be who you are. And if that person welcomes that, perfect. That's a good fit. If not, feel free to move on, and that's okay. And we're not going to have hard feelings about that as therapists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well said. And one of the reasons I started this show was to actually share stories. It started with a lot of immigrant stories. And at that time when I started was in 2016, and I was frustrated over the divisiveness of the country. And I thought, this is all I can do, is like get stories out there and have people share. And, you both have kind of a different immigrant story experience. You both gravitated towards California. I don't know if that's where you grew up, but I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about that if you're, open to sharing. So Helen, you can start.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing too is how every generation is so different. And like, okay, that's true for everyone, but right, you like add on this extra layer if you're an immigrant or refugee, right? So and then even I look at it now, like I look at my niece and nephew who are their teenagers now, and I'm like, I wonder, how it is in some ways that there are things that are like cool that are Asian now in their lives, like every teenager goes to get boba and watches anime and, and there's some like really great like celebrities or just things that it's just a really different experience. I think when I came and, we were very working class, we were not like the immigrants now. There's a lot of sort of rich tech, higher educated immigrants. My parents took a huge cut in their professional status when we came here. And it was largely so my dad could teach Kung Fu. And so my brother could have better educational opportunities, I think was really the focus. But I do feel lucky that growing up in the Bay Area, like we lived in San Francisco way back when an immigrant family could afford to live in San Francisco. And then all around the Bay Area, in Daly City and such. And so I do feel lucky in that sense. And yet, even in a very, very Asian American place, we still have in our communities like sexism and homophobia and classism, all those things still exist. And I think, I will joke about it, but I'm like, part of what made me a very good therapist is I'm like, oh, I did all the bad things and I went through all my own identity struggles, when I was a teenager. So like, I know all about that and experienced it. And so, yeah, sometimes it is like, well, this work is also trying to be a little bit more of maybe the provider or the mentor that like didn't exist when I was a lot younger.
Yeah. And just to kind of throw it out there, because I would love for our listeners to know, we have this martial arts connection with both of our fathers being Kung Fu masters and teaching. And I can certainly empathize of what it's like to be in a martial arts household. I'd love to hear a little about that experience for you in terms of expectations. And, I just feel like there's a little bit of a connectivity here because, of course, Su Sifu, I know of and have met. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the behind the scenes in the household.
Yeah. It was, I think, difficult for him. I actually give my parents a lot of credit in some ways. My dad is such an old-fashioned person, right? He's martial artist his whole life. He is 80 now and still teaching and writing. It is everything. And it's very traditional. But they actually made a decision at some point. They're like, oh my gosh, like it's too weird, the dynamic between us two, him trying to teach me and us both being mad at each other. At one point, they're like, okay, you could do something different, like dance. But we have to find a teacher who's also like super strict. So culture, they're like, oh, American teachers are terrible. Even if you're awful, they'll say good,
I get that.
Yeah.
I get that. No, it is a rarity actually for someone to, because I have so many friends in the martial arts that their kids did not continue on in the tradition. So I'm actually kind of the outlier in that I have taken that legacy and continuing it on. It's kind of a rarity, but it is funny because I know so many Kung Fu masters and it's like they had daughters or there was like, because normally they want that male, to carry on the tradition. And it's just kind of interesting to meet another female daughter of a Kung Fu Sifu. So it's a lot of fun, but I get the, in the American teachers, they're so nice and everyone wins and there's compliments. I was like, a compliment? What is that? A compliment is like, that wasn't the worst horrible thing I've ever seen. So let's go on.
Okay. But I do think growing up with a whole life understanding about martial arts, one thing is this idea of mind, body health and holistic health, right? Which is very culturally congruent. I think I always point out to people like, listen, those of us who are more communal and who have also ancient healing things, we are the global majority. We're not minorities. We're only minorities here.
Right.
But we're actually the global majority. And there's a lot of things that I am thankful that I learned. Because so much about mental health too is do you know how to be in tune with your body? Do you know how to take care of your body and utilize that mind, body health, which is something I think Western medicine tends to separate out in a super artificial way.
Understood. And Dr. Catherine, share a little bit about your experience. And did you go straight to California also, or?
Yeah. So we had a different immigration pattern. So a couple of my uncles and aunts had already moved. And so they were thankfully nice enough to kind of take us in, lived in San Francisco for a bit of time with my uncle over there, and then kind of settled into Los Angeles. And then for graduate school, moved to Boston. But I think, kind of like how Helen was talking about, you did all the bad things of identity development. I'm so ashamed to say it, but there were many moments in my time as growing up. I moved here in 13, wanting to fit in, wanting to be quote unquote normal, where I rejected a lot of my Filipino identity. And it's how do I be more white so that I fit in with all my other white friends? And it honestly took college to be at UCLA, thankfully, which is this beautiful, I like to think of it as this mecca of Asian American identities coming together in a way. I mean, not without its flaws, but in a way, finding myself in that, and some of my closest friends being of Asian heritage, and really kind of embracing that culture in a way, to the point that when I moved to Boston, which is a very, very white community, it was oh, we're back in this again. But it was thankfully in a different space where I could welcome and, want to be a part of my culture. In fact, I'm wearing a jacket that was created by Filipino tribesmen, because I was really I want this to be a part of my day-to-day life in a way that I didn't before, because, the way to seem cool and normal is to be white. But now it's this interesting and I think very hopeful flip for me is this embracing of Korean culture, for example, with BTS and, and all of the Asian food and all of that stuff. So there's hope for me in that space, that hopefully the next generation won't have to go through the same thing that I did in terms of having to reject my culture, and just welcoming it and having it be a part of identity from the get-go.
Thank you for sharing that. I echo that experience. And it's funny, my husband and I, he's of Dominican descent, but he grew up in East New York, Brooklyn, where he didn't feel quote unquote the minority at the time. So he never had those feelings of well, I just want to be the white people and fit in. We kind of talk about that all the time. And I was well, here in Orlando, Florida, there was no Chinatown. This is not a very, I was born in Boston, but I moved here when I was 2. So it was very much that. And so it's funny because I always start the same way as you do, which is I'm so embarrassed to say, but at the same time, this is part of our identity and who we are. And it's made us, I think, appreciate it more later on. It's kind of revealing of who we are. So I think it's interesting that so many of us have that shared experience. And so you're certainly not alone there. And, I feel a little bit, not Ivy League enough to be in this conversation with my UCF my alma mater, but you're in it now, like you obviously, you were in your schools, you went to school, you're still in the college atmosphere. And something that I have been very anxious to speak with someone about who knows more is the fact that it's constantly been like in my ear over the years. I have a Kung Fu Sifu friend of mine that, she also went to Harvard and then teaches in the school systems and stuff. And she had mentioned that, well, you didn't know that, Asian Americans have like one of the highest suicide rates, especially amongst college students. And I was shocked at the time. And that was several years ago. And then it's like you sometimes will see something in the media occasionally, and then even in these panels and discussions, I really haven't heard it talked about quite enough. And I would be very grateful if both of you would kind of shine a light on, is that a myth? Is it a fact? I don't know if I didn't look up any statistics or anything like that, but, and both of you, being in the collegiate setting, just kind of sharing, what you know about that, and just kind of bringing to light a little bit of the concern that I've had and wanting to hear more about. So, Helen, you could start.
Mm-hmm. There is not a lot of good data about, for example, suicides. And then, it's not always clear because, thank goodness, a lot of people who actually attempt don't necessarily die by suicide. So we get another chance. But then there's also things about privacy. Like it's very open, for example, that we've had several deaths by suicide at Stanford campus. And so, for example, when Katie Meyer, who was a nationally ranked athlete, had died by suicide, that was national news on TV. But we've lost several absolutely amazing activists, very much loved Asian American students, and you don't really read about that. And so people don't know. And then there's sometimes the friends are very hurt, like, do not care about our loss. And the media does pick up on different things, right? Like a blonde, beautiful national athlete has a different news story. But also sometimes our families want privacy.
Yeah.
Right. Like I am very proud when a family is willing to take their worst nightmare tragedy and say to the world, like, get help, fight stigma. Right. But a lot of our families, and we have international students too, that we've lost, brilliant undergrads and grad students, but often their families won't want to say. Right. And so we just don't really hear enough. And yet, if you talk to individuals in our community, you realize that we have a huge problem, Chinese community and the South Asian community, which is also very big here. When there was the Palo Alto suicide clusters of high school students a few years back, it was so bad, so much worse than the national average that the Center for Disease Control actually came here to Palo Alto to figure out why are all these students who are from comfortable, good upper class homes, in such despair. And what's not always known too is half those students were either Asian or half Asian. So there's a lot of things that we need to talk about in our community. And also one thing too is I'm very grateful to Iris Chang's family. So she was the world famous author of The Rape of Nanking, incredibly, incredibly accomplished. And she had died by suicide. And I'm very grateful that her parents and her brother had actually come out in the Chinese community to tell people, get help, talk to people, don't wait.
Yeah. Yeah. And Catherine?
I agree with Helen. There's a lot of silence, I think, not only with just Asian Americans stories in mental health, but just in general. We think about what stories get picked up in the national news. I think about the New York stabbing and what went on with that, and the silence around that, and Asian Americans being mad about it. And in the context of the work that I do with college students, there is unfortunately a silence in that as well. But, speaking anecdotally to the work of within UCLA, there has been unfortunately an uptick of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. And that percentage actually even increases more if we talk about intersectionality within Asian LGBT students, for example. And I think there's a number of reasons around that. I think one being just, I remember studying too the Stanford suicide, and we talk about this for a lot of Asian students. We have this idea of the model minority myth, and we try so hard to fit this idea of we have to be successful, we have to be entrepreneurial, we have to be the best, and the pressures that create for college students, and the pressure that then also gets compounded with immigrant stories or refugee stories or first generation college students who are who have family members who look to them and say, you're the hope. You're the person who's going to make all of our sacrifices, all of our pain, all of our suffering worth it. And the pressures of what does it mean to fail a chemistry course, right? And not having the resources and the infrastructure or the safety net that a lot of other individuals in America who've grown up here might have, and Asian Americans might not have as well. And I think about, we talked about earlier, just representation within the mental health community and not having that cultural match and not being able to feel like they can speak to each other. But I think one of the biggest things that I'm hearing with a lot of my students is they feel like a burden. And that is like a constant ringing theme that comes out in a lot of my work with Asian Americans, is that if they're not doing well, they're a burden to others. So how else easier to remove that burden, unfortunately, which then gets compounded in like how I can go on and on about this, but like how we think about ourselves and our self-esteem and what that's been created to feel like in this, especially this current political climate where 1 in 5 Asian Americans have been experiencing discrimination, if not like hate crimes at this point for the past year, and our sense of belonging in a world that wasn't created for us, right? So there's just a lot of compounding factors. And unfortunately, because of the silence that's happening in the nation, there's also not a lot of research about this, and not a lot of resources to do the research about this. So we have to unfortunately go through anecdotal data a lot of the time.
Yeah, and that must be frustrating being, in the field and everything. I'm curious if, so one of the initiatives that I work on, I am the state lead for Make Us Visible Florida, which is a coalition of like parents, tutors, teachers, and we are just basically trying for AAPI history inclusion. So I wrote a bill last year. It's Florida, so obviously it didn't get passed. We have a struggle. California actually just joined Make Us Visible, so we're really excited to have them on board in our national coalition. And so we're trying to combat. Basically, education is our preventative solution to all of the rise of the anti-Asian hate crimes. We realize this has been something missing. I grew up here, public school system and private school educated, didn't get to learn anything, and I'm always very embarrassed over the fact. So I tend to lean towards education as a solution. So being that we're talking about mental health, we're talking about these suicides that are happening, where do you see the intervention in that? Is education part of that? Is there something that can be done in schools? Is there something we can do as a community, like maybe so that it becomes destigmatized other than just these conversations? Like, what do you see as maybe a solution to this clear problem of silence, but also maybe dispelling the model minority myth, Asian Americans not putting so much pressure on themselves? Like, how can we intervene, and what's the earliest you feel that can happen? I'm, not that we're going to solve it right here, but I'm just curious, like, what your thoughts are, because clearly you're both very, very passionate about this and have advocated and worked towards it. So whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah. I mean, all things are multifactorial, of course. So anything that is in the range of places that can help is helpful. I mean, for families, right? Like there's all this data that 0 to 5 is like one of the most important life stages, right? So if so things I've done in this region have included like bilingual parenting classes and things just about understanding all the ways that you can fortify children very young in the terms of self-concept, self-efficacy. But, after that, it's like school education is a huge part of it. And, in terms of reflection, like I've told my mentees, I mean, at this point, I'm like an academic grandma. Like I have supervisees that are supervisors and, teaching and doing all these things. But everything I've learned about leadership, and I'm the leader of national organizations, I realized actually really came from Asian American studies, not from psychology, not from my other things. It was actually Asian American studies that, actually made me realize, like, wait a minute, like we belong here. We have histories of resilience. Like there's all these things and role models and just really helped me to dismantle. And I know there's a lot of amazing colleagues at the DOFA Conference, Division of Filipino Americans. This idea of like, we really were all educated in a very colonized, weird way. And there's articles about that. They call it a weird education, Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic. Again, that's not the whole world. That is in fact a minority viewpoint. And so being able to center yourself, right, to understand that like my worth or my life is not my like math grade or my fancy car or my job. So that's a lot about too, what do our communities value, right? Like I've had South Asian colleagues who are like, I don't even like going to my community anymore because all everyone wants to do is compare their car and whose kid went to Harvard and blah, 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 and how harmful that is. But also I have to give credit, like young people these days are holding a lot. You know, I've had friends and colleagues be like, well, we were depressed as kids. Like we weren't like this. And I'm like, we didn't have school shootings like this. We didn't have climate disaster like this. We didn't have COVID. You know, we didn't have
social media to remind us every 30 seconds that this is happening. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Catherine, please.
Your comment about social media just reminded me, since we're on the topic of like suicide, of just the CDC has found that uptick happened in 2009, which, surprise, surprise to no one, was when like social media kind of ticked up. So just kind of keeping that in mind, of just remembering like they are holding a lot of pieces in that. And I try to make sure that all of my outreach and projects with all of the students, I remind themselves of that resilience. I am always kind of reminded about the work with community culture wealth, and I'm forgetting who kind of started that whole project, but it's talking about Asian Americans and minority groups and a strengths-based approach. For quite a bit of time, we talk about it in the context of like, here's the white default factory setting, and then we just modify and change psychology based on that. And I'm not going to name names, but I remember I was studying for an important exam, and one of the questions was like, what are Asian American clients most known for? And the correct answer was, we tend not to show emotions, which is just dilutes the experience of what Asian Americans can bring in therapy and how they can benefit from therapy. And so just being able to look at it from a strengths-based approach, that we have bilingualness that allows us to see the world in a variety of different ways. Like I know I think very differently when I'm talking in Tagalog versus when I talk in English. We have resiliency of all of the things that we've been through, the immigration stories that we've been through. We have our culture and our connectiveness of Filipino values, for example, that I hold dear, that I can bring into my spaces here. So it's just being able to remember that. And I'm now forgetting, I know I went on this tangent with social, but I'm forgetting the original question that I don't know if I'm answering at this point.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering like what intervention we can do, or, you know, what are ways that you think would be a good way to, you know, like I said, I lead to education. So like if there's a way you think we can try to be more preventative for this issue.
I think, again, as Helen already mentioned, like it comes from a variety of different ways. Like there are ways that we can do it, but I think also the culture, like the larger allyship network, also needs help in that way, where it's not just on Asian Americans to speak up about the model minority myth and the perpetual foreigner myth that we're all kind of familiar with, but it's up to people in power to also include us and make space for the different ways in which that we think, and the ways in which that our culture comes up in the ways that we talk. I also think it's being able to praise and value culture from a very early age. And I think we're kind of seeing that. I'm forgetting what it's called. There's a new Filipino cartoon that's coming out that speaks to like the importance of Filipino culture. And the more and more we have that in media, for example, podcasts like this, aside from mental health, I think there's a lot of variety of different ways, but it's just showing love to Asian American communities in as much way as possible, rather than just valuing the Western dominant ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, earlier, Helen, you mentioned like that 0 to 5, you know, life stage. And I think that's super important as well. And somebody, as you know, like we started martial arts really young, and they always say, oh, you start at least at 3 because so much happens in this time frame and your personality is formed. And as an advocate for survivors, one of the things, especially for children and child abuse, is like I'm always telling and advocating for parents to have these conversations with your 2-year-old that you think that you're not supposed to have. And I'm not the one to tell you how to do that because that's not my profession, but I'm telling you that I do know that needs to happen. And it's because of conversations that are not happening that lead to problems, right? So it's usually what we're not talking about, and what's uncomfortable and what feels scary to address. And I think maybe, resources for parents, because it's their first time being a parent too. Just because they're the parent doesn't mean they have the answers, and I tend, when I'm teaching my kids, I tend to realize I'm like, forget this. I need to go do parent seminars because the kids listen to what you say and they're just, they're learning, but the parents really need kind of a lot more support, I think, than we realize and that they ask for. Like usually they're not really asking for it, right? And so I feel like there's just a lot there with that age range, and then with like helping parents kind of learn more. So I know that we only have like 10 or so more minutes together, but I do want to address that it is AAPI Heritage and Mental Health Awareness Month. And I love that it's coupled together because I think they both need to be recognized in the same sentence so that we can get used to AAPI mental health being a thing, right? And being something that's common. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the last couple of years seeing a rise in the anti-Asian hate crimes. And I talked about it with the education initiative I'm having, but I mean, clearly this has been happening. It's just not been out in the media, out in the news. This has been even before the pandemic, but obviously with the virus, the COVID, it's just increased exponentially. And it's gotten to a point where we have our elderly who are scared to go grocery shopping. We have women who don't feel like they can walk home at night anymore safely. And obviously that's been really traumatic for everyone, obviously the victims and their families, but even for Asian Americans. What have you advice have you been able to give to the AAPI community in terms of like dealing with just all of that information and just all of that trauma? And what have you found to be good for like self-care? Like what recommendations do you tend to give?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing I'll say is, as you said, like getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, that's for real. A lot of times when I find the silence, the stigma, the avoidance, I'll hear a lot of parents say like, well, I don't know how to talk about this. And it's like, well, so that's also education, right? Education of kids, like understanding our histories and resilience, but education of parents, like, listen, these are normal things. Don't freak out. This is like developmentally in a lifespan, things are going to change. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It just means how you parent a 13-year-old is not how you parent like a 6-year-old, And don't be scared, because I consulted on a TV show that really addressed suicide. And that was really the one message I had for parents was like, you need to make it really clear that they can talk to you. Yeah. Because it's very clear to me, a lot of our students, I know Catherine sees it too, do not feel their parents can hear, think their parents will freak out. Well, and so there's very important conversations that don't happen because they don't have that faith. So education is huge at all levels of the lifespan. We should be lifelong learners. Yeah. And as for coping with all this, like right now, there's just so much in the world. I often, I have a video on my YouTube that talks about like immediate, middle, and long-term coping. Right. Long-term coping is advocacy. It is like community. It's allyship. It's policy. Medium is like, what are the self-care things we're doing, seeking therapy, whatever. But sometimes we also need the immediate. Like, I need to stop doom scrolling. I need to like do something mindful. I need to like make sure about my safety. So kind of thinking about what level you're able to do right now, realistically, instead of just feeling like overwhelmed. I think right now there's just so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Catherine?
Yeah, I think there's so much power in being able to step back. I think that's a lot of the times we take on this mantle of we're going to save the world and we're going to do advocacy, but sometimes we've also had enough, and it's okay to take a step back and find ways to empower ourselves. A lot of the big things that I think of with people that I've worked with on managing anti-Asian hate is how can we find joy in your community again? Because a lot of the times I unfortunately sit with a lot of Asian American students and they say, I wish I was different and I was an Asian American, and this kind of rejection of it because it's so scary to be Asian American right now, and finding joy again within the community. We talk a lot about the trauma, but finding joy. I'm remembering somebody had done a poem about Wuhan and the beauty of Wuhan outside of just being this kind of epicenter of COVID. And I feel awful that I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head, but it's finding these different places where we can find joy in what it means to be within community. But it also will look very different from somebody else, right? For one person, that can be going to a protest. For some person, that might be a quiet night in to kind of center themselves and be with themselves and be in that moment. For another, it might be hanging out with other similar Asian identified folks, but it's also one, not to judge other people's reactions about certain traumas that are going through it. We're just doing the best we can with what we have. And so it's checking in with ourselves and what does our body need? What does our body crave right now to make us feel safe, to make us feel like we can keep going to fight until the next day for what we need and who we are as people.
Yeah, thank you for that. And are there favorite resources that either of you usually recommend to people? Like, even if it's just a link or a book or your favorite XYZ that you feel our listeners could benefit from. And this could also be just, hey, I really like this book. It doesn't have to be, mental health textbook or a psychology book or anything like that. I just love some resource recommendations from you both. You're both so fascinating. I feel like I'm going to have you back on individually so we can really talk about your background and get into a little bit more so our listeners can get to know you. So hopefully you'll agree to do that. But I'd love to hear any of your recommendations that you have.
I mean, kind of on the nerdy scholarly front, I have to say the Asian American Journal of Psychology. A lot of people don't realize there's an entire scholarly journal that is all different kinds of AAPI psychology research. So that exists. And so that's like something that's been around for many, many years. And as for like not less scholarly, like, I don't know, I can't pick one off the top of my head. It's actually exciting that there feels like every month now there's a new Asian American author, which is absolutely fantastic. Like right now, I'm simultaneously reading What My Bones Know, which is Stephanie Fu's memoir about recovering from complex trauma, and Permission to Come Home, which is Jenny Wang's book. She's a Taiwanese American psychologist. And the entire UCLA Asian American Studies archive.
Oh, okay. I'll get to that.
just take everything from the library.
I'll definitely just fly on over and then I'll get to that. And that's fantastic. Catherine.
I think the one that I just absolutely fell in love with, it's a thick book and it's quite a bit of a read, but it's Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. I love it so much in a way of, she talks about all these individual stories and all the migration that happened within the Asian American community. And it was such a joy for me, even as a Filipino American, being like, oh, we were here in America since 1500. And they created like Manila Town and Louisiana. And now what the crab bake was Filipino food heritage that was then modified for Western cultures, and Filipino Americans were part of like the War of 1812 and like the mark of history. And it helped me at least feel like we are American, because there's always that question, right? Of we've been here a while, we've left a map within this entire nation. And so if you don't have time, feel free to just read the chapter that pertains to your particular culture. But if you do have the time, just reading the diversity of stories. And I just really love that book. So if you're looking for a read on the airport or a long plane ride or an audiobook, that's how I had it. I was driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and that was my audiobook through the whole way. But yeah, it's a great read.
Yeah, audiobooks have made me a quote unquote good reader. Like I did not digest books or anything like that. And I will be nerdy, but on a totally opposite academic spectrum of you two scholastic individuals. And I'm going to recommend a graphic novel, which is American Born Chinese by my favorite Jean Lin Yang, who is a friend of the show. And I actually work with him on projects and everything. And so shout out to him. But his book really captured that Asian American experience, and then really spoke to me with pictures.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of fun, but I appreciate the recommendations. Lots of times on this show, I always say this is really just like selfish hour where I get to learn, I get to talk to the people that I find interesting, and I get to, just digest everything for myself. And if hopefully someone will benefit from it as well. But I always feel so selfish about it, and just grateful to be able to share the space with you and learn from you both. On a fun note, you kind of mentioned food, and my listeners are going, here she goes now, because I love food and I love to talk about food. And since we share different cultures here, I would love for you to share a little bit about your favorite foods, or if you cook or anything in the culinary realm, since this is the celebratory AAPI heritage part. Let's talk food.
Right? Absolutely. It's like the greatest joy. And I've often told people, I do CrossFit, and a lot of people are very into certain eating things, but I'm like, I'm sorry, dieting is like against my culture. Like, no, it's a great joy. Of course, Taiwan is famous the world over for food, but you can't get anything here like Taiwan. So I'm really eager to go back, see my family again sometime. But I live in Fremont, California area, and we have amazing Afghan food. And in Oakland, we have amazing Cambodian food.
Oh, nice.
Tried it. Highly, highly, highly recommend. It's so good, and it's not expensive.
Oh, bonus.
I've gone to like very, very fancy restaurants and spent a lot of money and been like, I would have been better off at like Phnom Penh.
There you go. Well, it's such an important thing. And so when you do go back to Taiwan, what's the dish that you're like, okay, here's what I'm getting first stop?
Taiwanese breakfast, right? The youtiao, the soy milk, sticky rice. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And Catherine?
Yeah, no, similarly, my partner and I, we live very close to Koreatown. And so our go-to is what do we want for dinner? We're like, let's just roam around Koreatown and find something there. But kind of, yes, similarly in terms of Filipino food. Jeannie, who is my mentor, she created this cookbook on Instapot, Filipino food, which
highly recommend.
Highly recommended. Go get it, because some of my favorite foods and Filipino dishes take just forever to make. Kare kare is one of my favorite. It's this peanut based stew, but it takes so long the traditional way. And so if you can find a shortcut, and Jeannie's book, that's the way to go. But most of the time I just go over to my parents' house and they already have it done. And they were the ones who actually
by any chance, will you be making this tonight? Because if so, intent.
I will be there. Right. Oh, you did 12 hours of work for it? Perfect. I'll be there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the thing, right? Home cooked meals. And I mean, being, not to be stereotypical, but, in Asian culture, I really, food is kind of the center of the home. And it's the thing where you walk into any Asian household. Now, this I feel crosses many of the country lines. It's like, have you eaten? Do you want to eat something? It's that the moms always want to feed you or make sure you've had food. And I think it's just our way of showing love and nurturing, but it's truly just part of the soul for sure. I just
food. Definitely. I say that's the sixth love language is food, as my dad gives me a bunch of fruit every week. And it's like, here, have 20 mangoes that you will definitely not finish and eat in 1 week. But here you go. This is how I show you that I love you. So
yes. I mean, I would love if someone just delivered 20 mangoes every week to my house. Just if anybody's interested, please feel free. Don't be shy about it. That's amazing. And now that I'm getting hungry. So in closing, is there anything else you want to share with our listeners? I know you both have social media as well as websites. So I'll share all that here. But if there's anything you'd like to say or share, please do.
No, I mean, I just want to thank you both for spending the time, and I think we all have a role in reducing stigma and helping the healing of our own families and our own communities. Each person who learns something and shares something, and you don't know how powerful that is at helping somebody else feel ready to speak when they know that you're someone who isn't going to be judgmental about the fact that hey, we all are going to probably at some point in our lifespan have a period where we want support and help, and everyone can be a part of that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Give yourself the space, give yourself the time to find that therapist that's going to help you through your journey. I know a lot of people are like, I don't need that space, but we all deserve that space. So give yourself the time to do that. On a separate plug, Philippine Excellence is actually having a wellness month. And I'll be on then on Wednesday on the 25th, and we talk about how colonialization has impacted our mental health. So they have lots of other topics as well that they're going to be talking about throughout the month. So as a continuation on AAPI and mental health, go check them out. But thank you, both of you. I've learned so much being in this space, and also it's just so healing to just find other Asian Americans who just want to talk about mental health and the importance of it in our community. So thank you.
Anytime. Dr. Helen, Dr. Catherine, thank you both so much for spending time with me on a weekend. By the way, listeners know I never record on a weekend, and they took time out of their busy schedule so we could fit this in and get this out there during AAPI Heritage and Mental Health Awareness Month, which are so important. So thank you for the conversation. I hope you both will agree to come back and talk to me again. And one day we will be able to eat together.
Yes. In real life. Thank you.
That's the dream.
All right, ladies, have a lovely, lovely day.
That's all for today's episode. Thanks for listening to The Sifu Mimi Chan Show. Please subscribe and rate my podcast on your platform of choice and leave a review. You can become a patron of the show at patreon.com/SifuMimiChan to help keep this podcast going. Follow me and interact on social media at Sifu Mimi Chan on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.